Welcome back to the Facebook studios live at the Raisina Dialogue 2020. A lot of our conversations today are about the cacophony we hear on television, in the news, the state of the media, as it were, not just in India, but all over the world. In that din, in the noise of news debates with people sparring, very often we say that the small story is lost, the reporter's version is lost. To talk about what we can do to revive journalism, we have with us Supriya Nair, who has launched a very small startup called All Things Small. Yes. Supriya, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us. You've been a practicing journalist for some time now. What prompted you to do this in the digital space and essentially talk about reviving storytelling?
Maya, you've been a journalist yourself, and I've admired your reporting for so long. And you know as well as I do that in the newsroom, it feels like we're at an impasse in more ways than one. Mm-hmm. The philosophical problem, which is that journalism as an accountability mechanism isn't doing its job, seems to be a complaint that many journalists have within their newsrooms, regardless of ideology or or institutional bent. The second problem we've all faced is operational, right? Technology disrupted our ways of storytelling, and it disrupted how our attention is distributed, mm-hmm. so that it feels like to be in the news, we have to compete with the way content on social media platforms works, that we have to be viral, and that we have to deal with emotion at a fever pitch in order to get anybody's attention at all. And I think we have to do different things to try and figure out why our old model is broken, and how we can live in this new world and continue to tell the stories that are important.
So in that sense, it's appropriate that we're doing this discussion in the Facebook studio as well. But a couple of things that I want you to talk about, because one is about the disruption caused by technology. The other is about essentially financial constraints. Old technology, especially broadcast technology, is expensive. So it's become cheaper for a lot of people to be the citizen journalist as well. How do real journalists with real qualifications and a real commitment to the truth, in a sense, push their voice in this din?
I wonder if, but I'd like to know what you think about this as well. I wonder if the problem is not so much with the journalists not being able to do their job, although as you and I know there are several constraints to that, but that it's the institutions in which they work and the newsrooms in which they work that seem like they've become overly centralized. Mm-hmm. Journalism has become extremely expensive. Broadcast journalism, little needs to be said about how expensive it is to go out with an Obi van versus what it's like to shoot something on your mobile phone. But print revenues, are taking a dive. 10 years ago, people said that print was still a sunrise industry in India. I'm not sure there are many people, even in regional languages today, who feel optimistic about that.
Well, I think since you're asking me, I think one of the issues is the centralized structures of newsrooms and institutions and the dependence on revenues from advertising, from big advertisers, things like that, that could become a problem. But the second is also, you talked about how the sort of attention is divided and spread across many different stimuli coming from different directions. So how much is the audience responsible for the kind of news that is being put out there as well?
I'm not sure that there is a single audience. I find it very tempting, especially when an older family member forwards me something that's so clearly misinformation that they've received in turn on social media. It's very tempting for me to blame them for being too susceptible to this sort of thing. But an audience isn't centralized, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we as journalists have moved fast enough to try and be where our audience is. One of the things about the internet that I believed and still believe is that it requires a certain amount of participation from mm-hmm. its audience. Mm-hmm. It's not entirely lean back, and that's exciting, right? That means that we do have the terrifying job of figuring out in what format we tell our news and how we distribute it. Can we make a Facebook news story that is essentially about the same subject, that's essentially about the same story, as a TikTok news story, or something that gets pushed out on WhatsApp. Maybe what we need to do with the heft that we have is figure out how to be omni-format and omni-platform in a really nimble way. And the exciting thing about that is, I think at the moment at least, that's not, expense isn't a problem over there.
So
I think it's will.
how different is your model than, say, from a convergent newsroom?
I help run a very small startup that's also very young, and we are working on narrative nonfiction from India, which we will research and produce in a variety of formats. So we're looking at journalism and true stories as something that nourishes whatever format the stories end up in, and we're looking to reach an audience wherever they may be and however they may like
to
consume the story. I hope that we see abroad that there's a real appetite, for example, for true stories that are told as documentaries that people then binge for like
on
8 hours
Netflix.
on Netflix.
That's right. Yeah.
And we can also see Indian and Pakistani and Chinese youngsters who are doing remarkable things with 60-second videos that then become viral, and that allows them to talk about everything from human rights in China to technology to civics education and caste oppression. And I think perhaps we should look at that as an opportunity. And I hope that what we can do, and I hope that what those of us who are journalists who are now working in other mediums can do, is bring the values of journalism and bring accountability and bring all the things that make us important and vital to our audiences to these mediums which don't operate on those principles currently.
You just picked up on something which is very close to my heart, which is the values of journalism. Now, when I raise that point in different forums, one of the things that comes back at me very often is a criticism. Whose values? Who decided these values? They could be, an ideological value that you have superimposed on your journalism, and you have to combat this time and time again, because in an environment when we're bombarded with different kinds of news sources, very often, even for the discerning eye, it can be hard to tell what is fact-based, what is opinion. We have opinion masquerading as news all the time today.
Yeah, that I think is really the operational failure of journalism speaking, right? When you are competing for attention, that's what you end up doing, and you feel like a screaming match on primetime TV makes more sense than,
or clickbait on news websites,
than reportage.
Yeah.
I think that I'm hopeful that those are problems that we can solve. It's clear that there are things that, it's clear that audiences are biased and that they will gravitate to the kind of news that conforms those biases. And that one player kind of breaking the rules leads to an industry-wide disruption. We've seen this in industry after industry. But I mean, what is the value of journalism in the end? In every format, it is to serve its audience, and to serve that audience by standing on the side of the audience rather than on the side of an institution or the power that governs the people, right? That's not really all that hard, and that's fun. And I think journalists who've lost that should try and rediscover that.
Well, on that note, Supriya, I think all the more power to you and All Things Small, because I think what we do need is fresh energy in journalism and telling stories in a way that excite, that grip attention. I think that's the way forward. Maybe audiences will be convinced to move away from the screaming debates then in that case. Supriya, thanks very much for having this conversation with us.
Thank you, Maya.